If the fructose in sugar and high fructose corn syrup has been considered alcohol without the buzz in terms of its potential to inflict liver damage, what about the source of natural fructose, fruit? Only industrial, not fruit fructose intake was associated with declining liver function. Same thing with high blood pressure. Fructose from added sugars was associated with hypertension, but fructose from natural fruits is not. If you compare the effects of a diet restricting fructose from both added sugars and fruit to one just restricting fructose from added sugars, the diet that kept the fruit did better. People lost more weight with the extra fruit present than if all fructose was restricted across the board. The deleterious effect of fructose was limited to industrial fructose, meaning table sugar and high fructose corn syrup, with no evidence for a negative effect of the fructose in whole fruit. This apparent inconsistency might be explained by the positive effects of other nutrients, like fiber and antioxidants, in fresh fruit. Well, let's find out. If you have people drink a glass of water with 3 tablespoons of table sugar in it, which is like a can of soda, this is the big spike in blood sugar you get within the first half hour. Our body freaks out and releases so much insulin to drive down this spike, we actually overshoot, and 90 minutes in, we're relatively hypoglycemic, dropping our blood sugar below where it was before we drank the sugar. In response, our body dumps fat into our bloodstream as if we're starving. Because our blood sugars just dropped so suddenly below fasting levels, our body got worried. Now, what if you add blended berries in addition to the sugar, like a berry smoothie? Now, they have sugars of their own. In fact, in this experiment, an additional tablespoon of sugar's worth. So the blood sugar spike should be worse, right? No. Not only was there no additional blood sugar spike, here's the critical part: no hypoglycemic dip afterwards. Blood sugar just went up and down without that overshoot, and without the surge of fat into our blood. This difference was attributed to the semi-solid consistency of the berry meals, which may have decreased the rate of stomach emptying compared to just guzzling sugar water. In addition, the soluble fiber in the berries has that kind of a gelling effect in the intestines that slows the release of sugars. To see if it was just the fiber, they repeated the experiment with berry juice that had all the sugar but none of the fiber. Now, as you can see, there's a kind of a clear difference observed early on in the blood sugar responses. At the 15-minute mark, the blood sugar spike was significantly reduced by the berry meals, but not by the juices. But the rest of the beneficial response, like at 90 minutes, were almost the same between the juice and the whole fruit, suggesting that fiber may just be part of it. It turns out there are fruit phytonutrients that inhibit the transportation of sugars through the intestinal wall into our bloodstream. Phytonutrients in foods like apples and strawberries can block some of the uptake of sugars by the cells lining our intestines. So adding berries can actually blunt the insulin spike from high glycemic foods. Here's what white bread does to our insulin levels within 2 hours after eating it. Now eat that same white bread with some berries, though, and you're able to blunt the spike. So even though you've effectively added more sugars in the form of berries, there's less of an insulin spike, which has a variety of potential short and long-term benefits. So if you're gonna make pancakes, make sure they're blueberry pancakes. Low back pain became one of the biggest problems for public health systems in the Western world during the second half of the 20th century. The lifetime prevalence of low back pain is reported to be as high as 84%, and chronic low back pain currently affects about 1 in 5, with 1 in 10 being disabled. It's an epidemic. Are people just lifting more heavy stuff? No. Mechanical factors such as lifting and carrying probably do not play a major role in the disease. Well, then what causes it? I've touched on it before. Atherosclerosis can obstruct the arteries that feed the spine, and this diminished blood flow can result in various back problems. This can be seen on angiography, showing normal arteries on the left and clogged on the right, or on autopsy, where you can see the openings to the spinal arteries can get squeezed shut by these cholesterol-filled plaques on the right. Autopsy, because back pain may predict fatal heart disease. Just like clogs in the penile arteries, erectile dysfunction can precede heart attacks because It's the same disease, clogged, crippled arteries throughout our body. Now we have MRI imaging that can show the occlusion of spinal arteries in people with back pain and the degeneration of their discs, normal blood flow in someone without back pain versus constricted blood flow in someone with. They showed that patients with long-term lower back pain had these kinds of arterial clogs, and those with high cholesterol appeared to suffer more severe symptoms. Those with narrowed arteries appear about 8.5 times more likely to have suffered from chronic back pain. This makes sense. The discs in our lower back are the largest avascular tissue in the body, meaning our discs don't have any blood vessels. Thus, its nutrition just kind of diffuses in from the margins, making it especially vulnerable to deprivation. Using MRIs, you can measure the effects of impaired blood flow on that diffusion, and see how this can turn into that. Although disc degeneration has multiple causal factors, with genetic, occupational, and mechanical influences, alteration in nutrition has been proposed as the final common pathway. By age 49, 97% of the discs of those eating the standard American diet show at least grade 2 degradation. Cholesterol plaques in the walls of the aorta can obliterate the orifices, the lumbar and middle sacral arteries, and make decreased blood flow of the lumbar spine and surrounding structures. Structures with precarious nutrient supply, such as the intervertebral discs, may suffer and gradually degenerate from this lack of blood flow, as well as herniate. Not only is there a link between cholesterol levels and disc degeneration, there's association between cholesterol levels and disc herniation as well. This compromised blood flow may also damage the nerve roots that come off the spine, causing sciatica. Sciatica is back pain that radiates down the legs, causing additional pain, numbness or weakness, and prolonged disability, and may affect as many as 1 in 20 people. And independent of weight and some other factors, clinical sciatica may be associated with cholesterol as well. See, the nerve roots, which are most commonly associated with sciatic pain, are supplied by some of the arteries most vulnerable to atherosclerotic plaque formation. Obliteration of these arteries by cholesterol buildup results in compromised nutrient supply to the nerve itself, and that lack of oxygen to the nerve may be playing a role in sciatica pain. Reduced blood flow also hampers the removal of waste products, such as lactic acid, which can in turn irritate the nerve endings, causing pain and deterioration. Because of this vulnerability, discs degenerate far earlier than do other musculoskeletal tissues. The first unequivocal findings of degeneration in the discs of the lower spine can be seen starting around age 11. By the early teen years, you can already see the discs starting to degenerate. Right? And this makes sense. As I've talked about before, nearly all kids have the beginnings of atherosclerosis by age 10. And sadly, low back pain is now common in children and adolescents as well. It's becoming a real public health concern. And it's getting worse. It's like kids now getting disorders like adult-onset diabetes, teenagers starting their lives out with a chronic disease. That's why it's never too early to start eating healthier. Franklin Delano Roosevelt brought us through the Great Depression and World War II. Who knows how history would have been different had he not died in his 4th term as president from a massive stroke. In the following days and months, we learned that Roosevelt had suffered from severe high blood pressure for years. In spite of this, he was on no medications or other treatments. The reason for the lack of treatment is stark and simple. There were none. The state of the art at the time was death. Death from so-called malignant hypertension, out-of-control high blood pressure, for which it was thought there was no remedy. But they were wrong. There was Walter Kempner and his rice fruit diet. Physician-scientists trained with the best fled Nazi Germany and set up shop at Duke. We began treating malignant hypertension patients with a radical diet consisting of only white rice and fruit, with strikingly favorable results. A rapid reduction in blood pressure, rapid improvement in kidney failure, eye pressure, heart failure, and other manifestations of this previously fatal illness. He figured that if a low-salt diet helped with blood pressure, a low-protein diet helped with kidney function, and a low-fat and cholesterol diet helped the heart, why not take it to its logical conclusion and design a no-salt, no-cholesterol diet of almost pure carbohydrate? So he designed a diet with less sodium than any low-sodium diet, less protein than any low-protein diet, and less cholesterol and fat than any other low-fat diet. His hope was that it would just stop the progression of the disease. Instead, something miraculous happened. In about two-thirds of cases, the disease reversed. Reversal of heart failure, reversal of eye damage, reversal of kidney failure. Remember, this was effectively a terminal disease. People just had a few months to live, but if they went on the diet, most got better. Before and after. The round pictures at the bottom are photographs taken of the back of people's eyes, starting out swollen, bloody, and leaking, and then nearly normal in a matter of months. Kidney disease cured. A striking fact is that in some patients, after being effectively cured by the diet over many months, they could then relax the diet to a more conventional plant-based diet and go on and live a normal, active life. The rice diet may actually drop blood pressures too low, so you have to modify it, add back other foods to bring the pressures back up to normal. An editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine described Kempner's results as little short of miraculous. Practically speaking, there's probably no more effective diet for obese, decompensated cardiac patients. The problem, though, is that most physicians lack the extraordinary persuasive powers required to keep the patient eating such a restricted diet. When Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn presented his study results, demonstrating in some cases reversal of near end-stage heart disease with a whole-food plant-based diet, the chair of Cleveland Clinic's cardiology department asked, how can we expect patients to stay on a strict diet like this when we can't even get them to quit smoking? Just like penicillin drugs don't work at all unless you take them, plant-based diets don't work unless you actually eat them. I think the answer is that the physician must have a zealous belief in the diet and must convey that passion to the patients. For Kempner to keep his patients on the rice diet, Kempner browbeat, yelled at, and castigated them when he caught them straying. And he didn't just browbeat them, he sometimes actually beat them. It came out in a lawsuit in which a former patient sued Dr. Kempner that he had literally whipped her with a whip and other patients to motivate them to stick to the diet. Reminds me of the famous diabetes physician Arnoldo Cantini, back in the 1800s, who knew that the remedy for diabetes is not at the drugstore but in the kitchen. To ensure compliance, if necessary, he would lock a patient up for 6 weeks. Thankfully, in terms of personality, Dr. Esselstyn is the opposite of Dr. Kempner, polite, soft-spoken, gentle, able to keep his patients on track without whipping them. And last but not least, Esselstyn walks the talk, following the diet himself, whereas Kempner died of a heart attack, though at the age of 94. His work continues on in Durham, where they continue a relaxed version of the diet, allowing actual vegetables. A year before Roosevelt died, Kempner had already published his miraculous results. It seems highly likely that, had the rice diet been provided to President Roosevelt a year before his death, his disease might have been controlled before his fatal stroke, and that this fatal event could have been averted. Just like mosquitoes are the vectors of spread for malaria, a landmark article published last year in one of the most prestigious medical journals described food corporations as the vector of spread for chronic diseases. Unlike infectious disease epidemics, however, these corporate disease vectors implement sophisticated campaigns to undermine public health interventions. Most mosquitoes can't afford the top-notch PR firms. A key message was that alcohol and ultra-processed food and drink industries use similar tactics to the tobacco industry to undermine effective public health policies and programs. What they mean by ultra-processed is things like burgers, frozen meals, chicken nuggets, fish sticks, potato chips, donuts, soda pop. Ultra-processed foods and drinks can be thought of as a menace to public health all over the world. The best recommendation on all ultra-processed foods, irrespective of their nutrient profiles, is to avoid them, or at least minimize their consumption. But how is the food industry like the tobacco industry? Well, the first strategy is to bias research findings. For example, Philip Morris implemented the White Coat Project to hire doctors to publish ghost-written confounder studies purporting to negate links between secondhand smoke and harm, publishing biased cherry-picked scientific reports to deny harm and suppress health information. This is the actual internal industry memo describing the White Coat Project, designed to reverse the scientific misconception that secondhand smoke is harmful. Similarly, funding from these large food corporations biases research. Studies show systematic bias from industry funding, so we get the same kind of tactics from the food industry, supplying misinformation, use of supposedly conflicting evidence, and hiding negative data. The same scientists for hire that downplayed the risks of second-hand smoke are the same hired by the likes of the National Confectioners Association to say candy cigarettes are A-OK as well. Of course, Exponent declared no conflict of interest. The similarities between strategies used by the tobacco, alcohol, and food and drink corporations are unsurprising in view of the flow of people, funds, and activities across these industries, which also have histories of joint ownership, like Philip Morris owned both Kraft and Miller Brewing. So what's their strategy? As a former FDA commissioner described, the tobacco industry strategy was embodied in a script written by the lawyers. Every tobacco company executive in the public eye was told to learn the script backwards and forwards. No deviation was allowed. The basic premise was simple. Smoking had not been proved to cause cancer. Not proven, not proven, not proven. This was stated insistently and repeatedly. Inject a thin wedge of doubt. Create controversy, never deviate from the prepared line. It was a simple plan, and it worked. Internal industry memos make this explicit. Doubt is our product, since it's the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. So, the general public is convinced that cigarettes are in some way harmful to health. So, objective number one, to set aside in the minds of millions the false conviction that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer and other diseases, a conviction based on fanatical assumptions, fallacious rumors, unsupported claims, and the unscientific statements and conjectures of publicity-seeking opportunists. We need to lift the cigarette from the cancer identification as quickly as possible, and to establish once and for all that no scientific evidence has ever been produced, presented, or submitted to prove conclusively that cigarette smoking causes cancer. Similar to what's now coming out of the food industry, from the same folks that brought us smoke and candy. There are dietary guidelines for food, but what about for beverages? A beverage guidance panel was assembled to provide guidance on the relative health and nutritional benefits and risks of various beverage categories. They ranked them from 1 to 6, and water ranked number 1. Soda ranked last at number 6. Whole milk was grouped with beer, with a recommendation for 0 ounces a day, in part out of concern for links between milk and prostate cancer, as well as aggressive ovarian cancer, thanks to IGF-1. Number 2 on the list, though, after water, was tea and coffee, preferably without creamer or sweetener. Even without creamer, though, lots of unfiltered coffee can raise cholesterol levels, but the cholesterol-raising compounds are trapped by the paper filter in brewed coffee, so filtered coffee is probably better. But 10 years ago, a study was published on the effects of coffee and endothelial function, the function of our arteries. Within 30 minutes of drinking a cup of coffee, there was a significant drop in the ability of our arteries to dilate, whereas decaf did not seem to have a significant effect. This was the first study to demonstrate an acute unfavorable effect on arterial function for caffeinated coffee. But 1 cup of decaf didn't seem to affect performance, and 2 cups of decaf appeared to have a beneficial effect. So maybe it's a battle between caffeine and antioxidants. Something in caffeinated coffee appears to be hurting arterial function, whereas something in decaf appears to be helping, maybe the antioxidants. It's like the story with red wine. De-alcoholized red wine significantly improves arterial function. So there's grape components trying to help, but the presence of alcohol counteracts and erases the benefit. Drinking really high antioxidant coffee by preparing it Greek style, for example, where you actually drink some of the grounds, may actually offer an advantage. That something in caffeinated coffee that appears to hurt, though, may not be the caffeine. In a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover study, researchers found that caffeine alone, about 2.5 cups of coffee worth, significantly improved arterial function in both people without and with heart disease. See, coffee contains more than 1,000 different components other than caffeine, many of which are also removed by the decaffeination process. So there must be something else in the coffee bean that's causing the problem. In fact, caffeine may even enhance the repair of the fragile inner lining of our arteries by enhancing the migration of endothelial progenitor cells, the stem cells that patch up potholes in our artery walls, one could say. But how might we get the potential benefit of caffeine without the risky compounds in caffeinated coffee? Tea consumption enhances artery function, substantial beneficial effects from both green tea and black tea. Instead of other components in tea leaves undermining caffeine's potential benefits, they appear to boost the benefit in healthy individuals as well as heart disease patients, reversing some of their arterial dysfunction, both immediately and in the long term. Now, all the measurements in this and the other studies were done on the brachial artery, the main artery in the arm, just because it's easier to get to. What we care about, though, is blood flow to the heart, and caffeine appears to impair blood flow to our heart muscle during exercise, even in healthy folks, but especially those with heart disease. Thankfully, caffeine in tea form appears to have the opposite effect, significantly improving coronary blood flow, suggesting that tea consumption has a beneficial effect on coronary circulation, though the addition of milk may undermine the protective effects. We know vegetarians have considerably lower obesity rates compared to those that eat meat, but why? Is it because they're not eating meat, or because they're eating more plants? Or maybe they're just eating fewer calories or exercising more? This study controlled for all that. In essence, they took men and women who ate the same number of calories a day, ate the same amount of vegetables and fruit, grains, same amount of exercise, but ate different amounts of meat. Men and women who ate less than a single serving a day of meat were on average not overweight, but the more meat they ate, the heavier they were, and by 1.5 servings a day, they crossed the threshold, a BMI of 25, to become officially classified as overweight. Which type of meat was the worst? If you remember back to that study of hundreds of thousands of men and women, poultry consumption appeared to be the worst. But maybe it was reverse causation, meaning obesity led to greater chicken consumption, not the other way around. This new study controlled for that, adjusting for dietary habits, yet found the same thing. Chicken consumption was most associated with weight gain in both women and men, and it didn't take much. And compared to those who didn't eat any chicken at all, those eating about 20 or more grams of chicken a day had a significantly greater increase in their body mass index. That's around 1 chicken nugget, or a single chicken breast once every 2 weeks, compared to no chicken at all. In a Harvard study of hundreds of thousands of people compared to non-coffee drinkers, those drinking up to 4 more cups a day only appeared to have half the suicide risk. What about more than 4? A Kaiser Permanente study of 100,000 people found that suicide risk continued to drop, 80% lower at more than 6 cups a day. Now, 8 or more cups a day, though, is associated with increased risk. Perhaps those with more severe forms of depression try to use very high doses of coffee as a form of self-medication to make themselves feel better, but was nonetheless insufficient to elevate their mood. It may also matter what goes into the coffee. The NIH AARP study of hundreds of thousands of Americans followed for years found that frequent consumption of sweetened beverages, especially diet drinks, may increase depression risk among older adults, whereas coffee consumption may lower the risk. Whether soda, or fruit-flavored drinks, or iced tea, those artificially sweetened appeared to carry higher risk. Same with hot tea or coffee. There was a benefit in coffee drinkers compared to non-drinkers, but add sugar, and much of that benefit disappears, and add equal or sweeten low, and the risk may go up. Various effects of artificial sweeteners, including neurological effects, have been suspected. For example, aspartame, the chemical in Equal and NutraSweet, may modulate brain neurotransmitters such as dopamine and serotonin, although data have been controversial, inconsistent. Scientific opinions range anywhere from safe under all conditions to unsafe at any dose. The controversy started in the 80s, soon after aspartame was approved. Researchers at the Mass College of Pharmacy and MIT noted that given the very large number of Americans routinely exposed, if only 1% of the 100 million Americans thought to consume aspartame ever exceed the sweetener's accepted daily intake, and if only 1% of this group happened coincidentally to have an underlying disease that makes their brains vulnerable to the effects, then the number of people who might manifest adverse brain reactions attributable to aspartame could still be about 10,000, a number on the same order as the number of brain and nerve-related consumer complaints already registered with the FDA before they stopped accepting further reports of adverse reactions to the sweetener. Who might be especially vulnerable? Those with a history of depression. Researchers at Case Western designed a study to ascertain whether individuals with mood disorders are particularly vulnerable to adverse effects of aspartame. Although they had planned on recruiting 40 patients with depression and 40 controls, the project was halted early by the Institutional Review Board for safety reasons because of the severity of reactions to aspartame within the groups of patients within the group with a history of depression. It was decided that it was unethical to continue to expose people to the stuff. It's interesting. Normally when you study something, a drug or a food, the company usually donates it to the researchers because they're proud of the benefits or safety of their product. But the NutraSweet company refused to even sell it to them. But they managed to get their hands on some, and within a week, there were significantly more adverse effects reported in the aspartame group than in the placebo group. They concluded that individuals with mood disorders may be particularly sensitive to aspartame, and therefore its use in this population should be discouraged. In a review of the direct and indirect cellular effects of aspartame on the brain, it was noted that there are reports of aspartame causing neurological and behavioral disturbances in sensitive individuals, headaches, insomnia, seizures, but they go further and propose that excessive aspartame ingestion might be involved in the development of certain mental disorders, and also in compromised learning and emotional functioning. They conclude that due to all the adverse effects caused by aspartame, it is suggested that serious further testing and research be undertaken to eliminate any and all controversies. To which someone wrote into the journal that there really is no controversy. Aspartame really is potentially toxic stuff. But what do they mean, excessive ingestion? Well, the latest study on the neurobehavioral effects of aspartame consumption put people on a high aspartame diet compared to a low aspartame diet. But even the high dose, at 25 milligrams per kilogram, was only half the kind of limit set by the FDA. So the FDA says one can safely consume 50 a day, but after just 8 days on half that, participants had more irritable mood, exhibited more depression, and performed worse on certain brain function tests. And these weren't people with pre-existing history of mental illness. These were just regular people. They conclude that given that the higher intake level tested here was well below the maximum accepted daily intake level, 40 in Europe, 50 here, careful consideration is warranted when consuming food products that may affect neurobehavioral health. Easier said than done, since it's found in over 6,000 foods, apparently making artificial sweeteners impossible to completely eradicate from daily exposure. impossible? While that may be true for the great majority of Americans, it's only because they elect to eat processed foods, right? So there's another reason to stick to whole foods. Then you don't even have to read the ingredients list, because the healthiest foods in the supermarket are label-free. They don't even have ingredient lists. Much of the low-carb and paleo reasoning revolves around insulin. To quote one random blogger, carbohydrates increase insulin, the root of all evil when it comes to dieting and health. So the reasoning goes, because carbs increase insulin, we should stick mostly to meat, which is fat and protein, no carbs, so no increase in insulin, right? Wrong. We've known for half a century that if you give someone just a steak, no carbs, no sugar, no starch, their insulin goes up. Carbs make your insulin go up, but so does protein. In 1997, an insulin index of foods was published, ranking 38 foods on which stimulates insulin levels the most. What do you think causes a larger insulin spike? A large apple and all its sugar, a cup of oatmeal packed with carbs, a cup and a half of white flour pasta, a big bunless burger, no carbs at all, or half a salmon fillet? What do you think? The answer is the meat. Now, they only looked at beef and fish, but subsequent data showed that there's no significant difference between the insulin spike from beef versus chicken or pork. They're all just as high. Thus, protein and fat-rich foods may induce substantial insulin secretion. In fact, meat protein causes as much insulin release as pure sugar. So, based on their own framework, if they really believe insulin is the root of all evil, then low-carbers and paleo folks would be eating big bowls of white spaghetti day in, day out before they'd ever touch meat. Yes, having hyperinsulinemia, too high levels of insulin in the blood, like type 2 diabetics have, is not a good thing. It may increase cancer by like 10%. But if low-carb and paleo people stuck to their own theory, if it's all about insulin, then they would be telling everyone to eat vegetarian. Vegetarians have significantly lower insulin levels, even at the same weight. It's true for ovo-lacto vegetarians. It's true for lacto-vegetarians and vegans. Those who eat meat have up to 50% higher insulin levels. Put someone on a strictly plant-based diet, a man, woman, young, old, skinny, or fat, and you can significantly bring their insulin levels down within just 3 weeks on this kind of healthy vegan diet. And then just by adding egg whites back to their diet, you can increase evil insulin production 60% within 4 days. What if you take people and add carbohydrates, double their carbohydrate intake? You can bring their insulin levels down. Why? Because they weren't feeding people jelly beans and sugar cookies. They were feeding people whole plant foods, lots of whole grains, beans, fruits, and vegetables. What if you put someone on a very low-carb diet, like an Atkins diet? Low-carb advocates assumed that it would lower insulin levels. Dr. Westman here is the new Dr. Atkins, after the old Dr. Atkins died overweight, according to the medical examiner, with a history of heart attack, congestive heart failure, and hypertension. But Dr. Westman was wrong. No significant drop in insulin levels on very low-carb diets. What they got is a significant rise in their LDL cholesterol levels, the #1 risk factor for our #1 killer, heart disease. Now, Atkins is an easy target, though, right? No matter how many extra new Atkins diets that come out, it's still old news. What about paleo? The paleo movement gets a lot of things right. They tell people to ditch dairy and donuts, eat lots of fruits, nuts, and vegetables, cut out a lot of processed junk. But this new study is pretty concerning. Take a bunch of young, healthy folks, put them on a Paleolithic diet along with a CrossFit-based, high-intensity circuit training exercise program. Now, if you lose enough weight exercising, you can temporarily drop your cholesterol levels no matter what you eat. I mean, you can see that with stomach stapling surgery, tuberculosis, chemo, a good cocaine habit. I mean, just losing weight by any means can lower cholesterol, which makes these results all the more troubling. 10 weeks of hardcore workouts and weight loss, and LDL cholesterol still went up. And it was even worse for those that started out the healthiest. Those starting out with really good LDLs, under 70, had a 20% elevation in LDL, and their HDL dropped. Right? Exercise is supposed to boost your good cholesterol, not lower it. The paleo diet's deleterious impact on blood fats is not only significant, but substantial enough to counteract the improvements commonly seen with improved fitness and body composition. Exercise is supposed to make things better. Put people instead on a plant-based diet and a modest exercise program, mostly just walking-based, and within 3 weeks can drop their bad cholesterol 20% and their insulin levels 30%, right, despite the 75 to 80% carbohydrate diet. Whereas the paleo diets appear to negate the positive effects of exercise. 58,000 Americans are diagnosed with kidney cancer every year, and 13,000 die. And the numbers have been going up. Approximately 4% of cases are hereditary, but what about the other 96%? The only accepted risk factor has been tobacco use, but cigarette smoking has been declining. Nitrosamines are one of the most potent carcinogens in cigarette smoke, so much so there's a concern that non-smokers may be inadvertently exposed through so-called third-hand smoke. See, the risks of tobacco exposure do not end when the cigarette is extinguished. Residual smoke particles can contaminate surfaces. About 80% of these nitrosamines in secondhand cigarette smoke stick to room surfaces and are not removed under normal ventilation conditions. That's why it's important to only stay in smoke-free rooms in hotels. The bottom line is that there's no way to safely smoke indoors, even if there's no one else there. Nitrosamines are considered so toxic that carcinogens of this strength in any other consumer product designed for human consumption would be banned immediately. If that were the case, they'd have to ban meat. One hot dog has as many nitrosamines and nitrosamides as 5 cigarettes, if you do the math. And these carcinogens are also found in fresh meat as well, beef, chicken, and pork. So even though smoking rates have dropped, perhaps the rise in kidney cancer over the last few decades maybe have something to do with meat consumption. But would it just be the processed meats, like bacon, sausage, hot dogs, cold cuts that have nitrate and nitrite additives, or fresh meat as well? We didn't know until now. The NIH-AARP study is the largest prospective study on diet and health ever, with over 4 million years of follow-up. 500,000 people, followed for about 9 years. In addition to examining nitrate and nitrite intake from processed meat, they also looked at intake from other sources, such as fresh meat, eggs, and dairy. There are nitrates in vegetables too. Should we be worried about those? No. Nitrite from animal sources, not just processed meats, was associated with an increased risk of kidney cancer. Total intake of nitrate and nitrite from processed meat sources was also associated with cancer, but they found no association with nitrate or nitrite intake from plant sources. But nitrates from processed meat was associated with cancer. That's when they advertised their bacon or lunch meat as uncured, no nitrites or nitrates added, except for the celery juice they added, which is just a sneaky way to add nitrites. See, they ferment the nitrates in celery to nitrites, then add it to the meat, a practice even the industry admits may be viewed as incorrect at best or deceptive at worst. But that same fermentation of nitrates to nitrites can happen thanks to bacteria on our tongue when we eat vegetables. So why are nitrates and nitrites from vegetables on our tongue okay, but nitrates and nitrites from vegetables in meat linked to cancer? Because the actual carcinogens are not nitrites, but nitrosamines and nitrosamides. In our stomach, to turn nitrites into nitrosamines and nitrosamides, we need amines and amides, which are concentrated in animal products. And vitamin C and other antioxidants in plant food block the formation of these carcinogens in our stomach. That's why we can safely benefit from the nitrates in vegetables without the cancer risk. In fact, some of the highest nitrate vegetables, like arugula, kale, and collards, are associated with decreased risk of kidney cancer. The more plants, it appears, the better. Plant-based diets and fiber-rich diets are recommended to prevent cancer directly, as well as chronic conditions associated with kidney cancer, such as obesity, high blood pressure, and diabetes. So a plant-based diet may help protect against kidney cancer directly or indirectly. It's like sodium intake and kidney cancer. Sodium intake increases kidney disease risk, but is it just because it increases blood pressure? No. It appears the salt is associated with increased cancer risk even independently of hypertension. What about plant-based diets? It turns out the protective association remains even in people who aren't obese, with normal blood pressure. So overall, plant-based and fiber-rich diets appear to do both, decreasing cancer risk both directly and indirectly. Recent observed feminization of aquatic animals has raised concerns about estrogenic compounds in water supplies and the potential for these chemicals to reach drinking water. While much attention has been focused on the environmental impacts of xenoestrogens, the endocrine-disrupting industrial pollutants, relatively little research has examined the ecological consequences of environmental loading with actual estrogens. This is somewhat surprising, given that the potency of some estrogens can be thousands of times more estrogenic than typical endocrine-disrupting chemicals. Estradiol, for example, is at least 10,000 times more potent than most xenoestrogens, and dietary exposure to natural sex steroids in meat, dairy, and eggs is therefore highly relevant in the discussion of the impact of estrogens on human development and health. And like chicken estrogen is identical to human estrogen, they're identical molecules, so it doesn't matter if it ends up in our drinking supply from women taking birth control pills excreting it in their urine, or cows excreting it into their milk. The source doesn't matter, the quantity does. And a child's exposure to estrogens in drinking water is about 150 times lower than exposure from cow's milk. So our day-to-day estrogen levels are more likely determined by whether or not we happen to eat dairy products that day. Human urine is often cited as the main source of natural and synthetic estrogens in the aquatic environment, but the level of estrogen, even in the urine of heavy meat-eaters who have significantly higher levels, pales in comparison to the estrogens excreted by the farm animals themselves. Pigs, sheep, cattle, chickens produce literally tons of estrogen every year. Women may excrete 16 micrograms every day, but farm animals may release 10 times more. In the case of pregnant cows, thousands of times more. Animal waste may contribute an estimated 90% of total estrogens in the environment. 5 gallons of runoff water contaminated with chicken manure may contain a birth control pill's worth of estrogen. Estrogen levels in poultry litter are so high that when farmers feed chicken manure to their animals to save on feed costs, it may trigger premature development. Poultry manure has been among the highest hormone content, quadruple the total estrogens, and 9 times more of the 17-beta-estradiol, the most potent estrogen, which could be considered a complete carcinogen, as it exerts both tumor-initiating and tumor-promoting effects. But who cares, though? From a human health standpoint, do we care about feminized fish or the appearance of intersex cockroaches? The problem is that the hormones get into our food supply. Endogenous steroid hormones in food of animal origin are unavoidable, as they occur naturally in these products. It's not a matter of injected hormones, which are banned in places like Europe in order to protect consumers' health. They're part of animal metabolism, and so as a matter of fact, all foodstuffs of animal origin contain steroid hormones, and the presence of hormones in food has been connected with several human health problems. Foods of animal origin in general naturally contain hormones, but cow milk may be of particular concern. The hormones naturally found in even organic cow's milk may be playing a role in the relationship found between milk and dairy products with human illnesses, such as teenagers' acne, prostate cancer, breast cancer, ovarian and uterine cancers, many chronic diseases that are common in Western societies, as well as male reproductive disorders. Milk consumption has been associated with increased risk of early puberty in girls and endometrial cancer in older age, but hormonal levels in food could be particularly dangerous in the case of vulnerable populations, such as young children or pregnant women. To this critical population, even a small hormonal intake could lead to major changes in the metabolism. Children are highly sensitive to sex steroids. Because their levels of sex steroids are very low before they hit puberty, even a small variation could account for a major change in the total activity of the involved hormone. Because no lower threshold for estrogenic action has been established, caution should be taken to avoid unnecessary exposure of fetuses and children to exogenous sex steroids, even at very low levels. In the AMA's Pediatrics Journal recently, the chair of Boston Children's Hospital's Obesity Prevention Center, along with the chair of Harvard's Nutrition Department, questioned dairy industry recommendations that children should drink 3 glasses of milk a day. Dairy milk evolved to promote the growth of grazing animals at high risk for predation when small, so need to put on a few hundred pounds pronto in the first few months of life. But the consequences of lifetime human exposure to the growth factors in milk have not been well studied. Milk consumption increases serum concentrations of insulin-like growth factor 1, which is linked to prostate and other cancers. In addition, modern industrial methods maintain dairy cows in active milk production throughout their pregnancies, resulting in a milk supply with high levels of reproductive hormones. Pregnant cows excrete significantly higher levels of sex steroids into their milk than non-pregnant cows. The subsequent consumption of such dairy products may mean an unnecessary risk, but one that can be easily avoided. And it's not just dairy. Although dairy products are an important source of hormones, other products of animal origin must be considered as well. All edible tissues of animal origin contain estrogen. This may explain why, in a study of over 1,000 women eating plant-based diets, vegan women had a twinning rate, which is 1/5 that of vegetarians and omnivores. Why is that a good thing? Because twin pregnancies are risky pregnancies. Complications are more likely to occur. Many parents and physicians even underestimate the negative consequences of multiple pregnancy, but women with multiple pregnancy face greater risk for themselves and their infants. Twin babies may be up to 10 times more likely to die at birth. To avoid these complications, this research team writes, women attempting conception should avoid milk and dairy products. Crohn's disease is an autoimmune disorder that affects more than 1 million Americans, inflammatory bowel disease, in which your body attacks your own intestines. There's currently no cure for Crohn's disease, and current research focuses on just controlling symptoms. There's no definitive medical or surgical therapy. In fact, the best we have is a more plant-based diet, which has afforded the best result in relapse prevention to date. They got the idea to try it because diets rich in animal protein and animal fat have been found to cause a decrease in beneficial bacteria in the intestine. And so they designed this semi-vegetarian diet to counter that, and 100% stayed in remission the first year, and 92% the second year. These results are far better than those obtained by current drugs, including these new so-called biological agents that can cost $40,000 a year, and cause side effects like progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, disabling and deadly brain disease, whereas the diet doesn't cost $40K, and what the worst that can happen is maybe get greens stuck in your teeth or something, and diet appears to work better. What about preventing Crohn's disease in the first place? Well, a systematic review of the scientific literature on dietary intake and risk of developing inflammatory bowel disease found that high intakes of fats and meat was associated with an increased risk of Crohn's disease, as well as ulcerative colitis, whereas high fiber and fruit intakes were associated with decreased risk of Crohn's. This was supported more recently by the Harvard Nurses' Health Study. 3 million person-years of data revealed that long-term intake of dietary fiber, particularly from fruit, was associated with lower risk of Crohn's disease. Women who fell into the highest long-term fiber consumption group had a 40% reduced risk, leading the accompanying editorial to conclude that advocating for a high-fiber diet may ultimately reduce the incidence of Crohn's disease. The irony is that the highest fiber group wasn't even reaching the official recommended daily minimum of fiber intake, but even just being less fiber deficient has a wide range of benefits, including, evidently, a significant reduction in risk of developing Crohn's disease. But why? The author suggests it's because fiber appears to play a vital role in the maintenance of our intestinal barrier function. Our skin keeps the outside world out, and so does the lining of our gut. But in Crohn's disease, this barrier function is impaired. You can see it under an electron microscope. The tight junctions between the intestinal cells have all sorts of little holes and breaks. The thought is that the increase in prevalence of inflammatory bowel diseases may be that dietary changes lead to the breakdown of our intestinal barrier, potentially allowing the penetration of bacteria into our gut wall, which our body then attacks, triggering the inflammation. We know fiber acts as a prebiotic in our colon, the large intestine, feeding our good bacteria, but what does fiber do in our small intestine, where Crohn's often starts? We didn't know until this landmark study was published. They wanted to find out what could stop this Crohn's-associated invasive bacteria from tunneling into the gut wall. They found that the invasion is inhibited by the presence of certain soluble plant fibers, such as from plantains and broccoli, at the kinds of concentrations one might expect from just eating them. They wonder if that may explain why plantain-loving populations have lower levels of inflammatory bowel disease. They also found that there was something found in processed foods that facilitated the invasion of the bacteria. Polysorbate 80, found predominantly in ice cream, but also found in Crisco, Cool Whip, condiments, cottage cheese. You just have to read the labels. What about maltodextrin, found in artificial sweeteners like Splenda, snack foods, salad dressings, and fiber supplements? Maltodextrin markedly enhanced the ability of the bacteria to glom onto our intestinal cells, though other additives, carboxymethylcellulose and xanthan gum, appeared to have no adverse effects. This may all help solve the mystery of why the increasing prevalence of Crohn's disease in developed nations, where we're eating less fiber-containing whole plant foods and more processed foods. What we need now are interventional studies to see if boosting fiber intake and avoiding these food additives can be effective in preventing and treating Crohn's disease. But until then, what do we tell people? Well, the available evidence points to a diet low in animal fat, with lots of soluble fiber-containing plant foods, and avoiding processed fatty foods that contain these emulsifiers, as well as making sure we're not ingesting traces of dishwashing detergent, which could have the same effect by just rinsing dishes well. They found that some people wash dishes and then just leave them out to dry without rinsing, which is probably not a good idea. Now, do we have studies that show that avoiding polysorbate 80 and rinsing dishes well actually helps? No. Nevertheless, advice based on best available evidence is better than no advice at all. Ciguatera is one of the most common forms of food poisoning, which occurs after the consumption of fish contaminated with neurotoxins produced by certain algae that build up the food chain. Just a few bites can be sufficient to induce the condition. Disturbingly affected fish look, smells, taste normal, and ciguatoxins are resistant to all forms of cooking, so there's no straightforward method to predict whether your tropical culinary dream will be followed by a ciguatera nightmare. Literally can cause nightmares. About 1 in 6 may experience signs of hallucinatory poisoning, lack of coordination, hallucinations, depression, nightmares. Most suffer some kind of neurological symptoms, tingling, numbness, and a burning cold sensation. For example, ciguatera sufferers have reported that a refreshing dive in the ocean actually caused burning pain, or that drinking cool beer felt like too hot coffee. So sometimes a reversal of temperature sensation occurs, like cold objects feel hot, vice versa. The toxin itself may also be apparently sexually transmitted either direction after fish consumption, or as one of my favorite public health bloggers put it, when hot sex turns cold and painful, blame it on dinner. And the symptoms can persist for months or even years. Ongoing research has shown that people with chronic fatigue syndrome may actually be suffering the long-term effects of this fish food poisoning, or a condition called polymyositis, which causes diffuse muscle aches, pain, inflammation. Some individuals intoxicated by fish consumption 25 years previously can experience a recurrence of the main neurological disturbances during periods of overwork, fatigue, stress. You can still find the toxins stuck in their body decades later. Recent outbreaks in New York City have drawn attention to the problem. A man eats grouper at a Manhattan restaurant and goes swimming 2 miles a day, to all of a sudden having difficulty walking. That lasts for months. But these aren't just rare anecdotes. Ciguatera fish poisoning affects an estimated 15,000 Americans every year, causing hundreds of hospitalizations, even a few deaths. And again, the toxins are colorless, odorless, tasteless, not destroyed by cooking. Therefore, CDC scientists suggest education efforts aimed at the prevention of seafood intoxication by avoidance of high-risk fish altogether. The AMA put out a similar advisory suggesting that the only way to prevent it is to avoid eating fish like red snapper or grouper. But the problem is that a third of fish sold in the U.S. is mislabeled, so you don't know what you're getting. Some suggest feeding a large fish flesh meal to a cat, treating them kind of like a court tester, and if they're OK 6 hours later, you can dig in, but this is considered inhumane. But if it's inhumane to feed it to your cat, how is it not inhumane to feed it to other members of the family? My favorite cancer-specific charity is the American Institute for Cancer Research, shown here lauding the China study and the documentary Forks Over Knives, with which they share the same bottom-line message. The healthiest diets are those that revolve around whole plant foods. This increased awareness, the importance of plant-based eating, is something the Institute welcomes. They then translate that advice into their 10 recommendations for cancer prevention. Do we actually have evidence, though, that those who follow such advice are actually protected against cancer? We do now. Breast cancer risk was reduced by 60% in women who met at least 5 recommendations compared to those who met none. The most important dietary advice was be as lean as possible within the normal range of body weight, eat mostly foods of plant origin, and limit alcoholic drinks. What about other cancers? Greater adherence to the AACR dietary guidelines was associated with significantly less breast, endometrial, colorectal, lung, kidney, stomach, oral, liver, and esophageal cancer. In other words, adherence to the dietary recommendations for cancer prevention may lower the risk of developing most types of cancer. The drop in bladder cancer did not reach statistical significance here, but a larger follow-up study following 469,000 people for 11 years, the largest to date, found that just a 3% increase in the consumption of animal protein calories was associated with a 15% higher risk of bladder cancer, whereas just a 2% increase in plant protein was associated with a 23% lower risk. AICR recommendation number 10 is that cancer survivors should follow the recommendations for cancer prevention. The same diet that can help prevent the cancer in the first place can be used to help save your life after diagnosis. Adherence to the guidelines for cancer prevention are found associated with lower mortality among older female cancer survivors, including specifically breast cancer. A cancer diagnosis is considered a teachable moment to get people eating and living healthier. They revel at the growth and the number of cancer survivors in this country, now 10 million strong and growing. It's great that those with cancer are living longer, but even better to prevent it in the first place, so we can all live longer. Not only does adherence to the guidelines lower cancer risk, but extends lifespan in general, because they're also significantly associated with lower hazard of dying from heart disease and respiratory disease, suggesting that following the recommendations could significantly increase longevity as well. What's good for cancer prevention is good for your heart, it's good for your lungs. And just as eating to prevent cancer helps to prevent heart disease, eating to protect our heart helps prevent cancer. I know it sounds self-evident, but adherence to a healthy lifestyle has been shown to be associated with lower risk of death. And the more healthy behaviors we have, the longer we get to live. That can mean not smoking, or walking every day, or eating green leafy vegetables at least almost daily. To help differentiate the effects of diet from other lifestyle behaviors like smoking and drinking on cancer incidence, Adventists were compared to Baptists. Both discourage alcohol and tobacco, but the Adventists go further, encouraging a reduction in meat. In general, the Adventists had a lower cancer hazard rate than the Baptists, and within the Adventist populations, the vegetarians did even better, and those eating the most plants did the best. Time magazine's recent cover exhorting people to eat butter could be viewed as a desperate attempt to revive dwindling print sales, but they claim to be reporting on real science. This systematic review and meta-analysis published in a prestigious journal that concluded that current evidence does not clearly support cardiovascular guidelines that encourage cutting down on saturated fat, like the kind found in meat and dairy products like butter. No wonder it got so much press, since reducing saturated fat intake is a major focus of most dietary recommendations worldwide, aiming to prevent chronic diseases, including coronary heart disease. So, to quote the Center for Science in the Public Interest, what gives? Evidently, shaky science and a mission by the global dairy industry to boost sales. They interviewed an academic insider who noted that some researchers are intent on showing saturated fat does not cause heart disease. In 2008, the global dairy industry held a meeting where they decided that one of their main priorities was to neutralize the negative impact of milk fat by regulators and medical professionals. And when they want to get something done, they get it done. So they set up a major well-funded campaign to come up with proof that saturated fat does not cause heart disease. They assembled scientists who were sympathetic to the dairy industry, provided them funding, encouraged them to put out statements on milk fat and heart disease, and arranged to have them speak at scientific meetings. And the scientific publications we've seen emerging since the Mexico meeting have done just what they set out to do. Here's some of the materials from that meeting. What does the industry think is the key barrier to increase worldwide demand for dairy? Yes, there's global warming issues, other milks competing out there, but number one on the industry's list is the negative messages and intense pressure to reduce saturated fats by governments and non-governmental organizations. In short, the negative messages are outweighing the positive. So, indeed, their number one priority is to neutralize the negative impact of milk fat among regulators and health professionals as related to heart disease. OK, so if you're the dairy industry, how are you going to do it? Imagine you work for Big Butter, right? You've got quite the challenge ahead of you. If you look at the recommendations from around the globe, there's a global scientific consensus to limit saturated fat intake, with most authoritative bodies recommending getting saturated fat at least under 10% of calories, with the prestigious U.S. Institute of Medicine and the European Food Safety Authority recommending to push saturated fat consumption down as low as possible. The latest guidelines from the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology recommend reducing trans fat intake, giving it their strongest A-grade level of evidence, and the same with reducing saturated fat intake. And since saturated and trans fats are found in the same place, meat and dairy, cutting down on foods with saturated fat will have the additional benefit of lowering trans fat intake. They recommend pushing saturated fat intake down to like 5 or 6% of calories. So that's what you see when you go to the American Heart Association website, no more than 5 or 6% of calories. People don't realize how small that is. One KFC chicken breast could take you over the top, or 2 pats of butter and 2 cubes of cheese, and you're done for the day. No more dairy, no meat, no eggs. That'd be about 200 calories. So they're in effect saying 90% of our diet should be free of saturated fat-containing foods. So that's like the American Heart Association saying, OK, 2 meals a week can be packed with meat, dairy, and junk, but the entire rest of the week should be unprocessed plant foods. That's how stringent the new recommendations are. So this poses a big problem for big cheese and chicken, the top contributors of cholesterol-raising saturated fat: cheese, ice cream, more cheese, chicken, then non-ice cream desserts like cake and pie, and then pork. So what are these industries to do? We'll find out next. Where did these consensus guidelines to dramatically lower saturated fat consumption come from? From literally hundreds of metabolic ward experiments, which means you don't just ask people to change their diets, you essentially lock them in a room for weeks if necessary and have total control over their diet. You can then experimentally change their level of saturated fat intake however you want, and see the corresponding change in their cholesterol levels. And the results are so consistent, you can create an equation, the famous Hegstad equation, where you can predict how much their cholesterol will go up based on how much saturated fat you have them eat. So if you want your LDL cholesterol to go up 50 points, all you have to do is eat like 30% of your calories saturated fat. When you plug in the numbers, the change in cholesterol shoots up right as predicted. The experiments match the predictions. In fact, you can do it at home with one of those home cholesterol testing kits. Eat a stick of butter every day, watch your cholesterol climb. Not rocket science. And look at this. This was 1965. We've known about this for 50 years. They even keep calorie intake the same. Increases in saturated fat intake are associated with highly significant increases in LDL bad cholesterol. Now, your good cholesterol goes up a bit too, but that increase is smaller than the increase in bad, which would then translate into increased heart disease risk overall. So if you feed vegetarians meat, even just once a day, their cholesterol jumps nearly 20% within a month. To prevent heart disease, ideally we need to get a total cholesterol under 150, which you can see these vegetarians were, but then even just once a day with the meat, and their cholesterol shot up 19%. But the good news is that within just 2 weeks of returning to their meat-free diet, their cholesterol dropped back down into the safe range. Now note that their HDL good cholesterol hardly moved at all, so their ratio went from low risk of heart attack to high risk in a matter of weeks with just one meat-containing meal a day. And indeed, randomized clinical trials show that dietary saturated fat reduction doesn't just appear to reduce cholesterol levels, but subsequent cardiovascular events like heart attacks as well. So we have randomized clinical trials, controlled interventional experiments. These are our most robust forms of evidence, right? So no wonder there's a scientific consensus to decrease saturated fat intake. You'll note, though, that the y-axis here is not cholesterol, but change in cholesterol. That's because everyone's set point is different. Two people eating the same diet, the same amount of saturated fat, the same number of chicken nuggets a day, can have very different cholesterol levels. One person can eat 10 chicken nuggets a day and have a LDL cholesterol of 90. Another person can eat 10 a day, could start out with a LDL of 120. It depends on your genes, but while our genetics may be different, our biology is the same, meaning the rise and drop in cholesterol is the same for everyone. So if both folks cut out the nuggets, the 90 might drop to 85, whereas the 120 would be expected to drop to 115. Right? Wherever you start, we can lower our cholesterol by eating less saturated fat, but if I just know what your saturated fat intake is, how many nuggets you eat, I can't tell you what your starting cholesterol is. All I can say with certainty is that, look, you eat less, your cholesterol will likely improve. But because of this extreme inter-individual variation, this wide variability in baseline cholesterol levels for any given saturated fat intake, if you take a cross-section of the population, you can find no statistical correlation between saturated fat intake and cholesterol levels, because it's not like everyone who eats a certain set amount of saturated fat is going to have over a certain cholesterol. So there's like 3 ways you could study diet and cholesterol levels: controlled feeding experiments, free-living dietary change experiments, or cross-sectional observational studies. Right? Well, as we saw, there's a clear and strong relationship between change in diet and change in serum cholesterol in the interventional designs. But because of that individual variability, in cross-sectional designs you can get zero correlation. In fact, if you kind of do the math, that's what you'd expect you'd get. In statistical parlance, one would say a cross-sectional study doesn't have the power for detecting such a relationship. Thus, because of that variability, these kinds of observational studies would seem an inappropriate method to study this particular relationship. So since diet and serum cholesterol have a zero correlation cross-sectionally, an observational study of the relationship between diet and coronary artery disease incidence will suffer from the same difficulties. So again, if you do the math, observational studies would unavoidably show nearly no correlation between saturated fat and heart disease. These prospective studies can be valuable for other diseases, but the appropriate design demonstrating or refuting the role of diet in coronary heart disease is a dietary change experiment. And those dietary change experiments have been done. They implicate saturated fat, hence the lower saturated fat guidelines from basically every major medical authority. In fact, if we lower saturated fat enough, we may be able to even reverse heart disease, opening up arteries without drugs, without surgery. But wait a second. Let's put our big cheese and chicken hat back on. Observational studies would show no correlation, mathematically could show no correlation. We've known since 1979 that observational studies simply don't have the power to show the relationship. Bingo! All we need now is a friendly researcher. How about Ronald M. Krauss, funded by the National Dairy Council since 1989, also the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, as well as the Atkins Foundation. Perfect. Then you just combine together all the observational studies that don't have the power to provide significant evidence, and what do you know? No significant evidence was found. This 2010 meta-analysis was basically just repackaged for 2014 using the same and similar studies. As the chair of Harvard's nutrition department put it, their conclusions regarding the type of fat being unimportant are seriously misleading, should be disregarded, going as far as suggesting the paper be retracted, even after the authors corrected a half-dozen different errors. But it's not like they falsified or fabricated data. They didn't have to. They knew beforehand the limitations of observational studies. They knew they'd get the right result, and so they published it, right? Helping to neutralize the negative impact of milk and milk fat by regulators and medical professionals. And it's working, brags the dairy industry. Perceptions about saturated fat in the scientific community are changing. This is a welcome message to consumers who may be tired of hearing what they shouldn't eat. They don't have to convince consumers, just confuse them. Confusion may be easily misused by the food industry to promote their interests. It's like that infamous tobacco industry memo again, right? Doubt is our product. Doubt is our product, since it's the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. They don't have to convince the public that smoking is healthy to get people to keep consuming their products. They just need to establish a controversy. Some science say it's bad, some science say it's not bad. Conflicting messages in nutrition cause people to become so frustrated and confused they may just kind of throw up their hands in the air and eat whatever they want, which is exactly what saturated fat suppliers want, but at what cost to the public's health. In public health school, we learned that there are 3 levels of preventive medicine. Primary prevention would be like trying to prevent someone at risk for heart disease from getting their first heart attack. Secondary prevention is when you already have the disease and are like trying to prevent your second heart attack. And tertiary prevention is like cardiac rehab, where we're just trying to reduce the complication rate. A 4th level was suggested in 2000, quaternary prevention, trying to reduce the damage from all the drugs and surgery from the first 3 levels. But people seem to forget about this 5th concept, introduced by the World Health Organization back in 1978, termed primordial prevention. But it is now being embraced by the American Heart Association's 2020 Strategic Impact Goals. Primordial prevention was conceived as a strategy to prevent whole societies from experiencing epidemics of the risk factors. The corresponding strategy at the individual levels to prevent risk factor development. Instead of trying to prevent someone with high cholesterol from getting a heart attack, why not prevent them from getting high cholesterol in the first place? So, the American Heart Association came up with the Simple 7. 7 simple health behaviors or factors: not smoking, not being overweight, being quote-unquote very active, defined as at least like walking 22 minutes a day, a few fruits and vegetables, below average cholesterol, normal blood pressure, and normal blood sugars. Their goal was to reduce heart disease deaths by 20% by 2020. Why so modest an aim? An improvement of 25% was deemed unrealistic. 15% was considered insufficient, so they decided on 20%. But if 90% of risk can be thrown out the window by simply engaging in simple lifestyle modifications, why is a 25% drop in death considered so unrealistic? To understand, one must realize just how bad our diets have gotten. The most common reason patients give for not complying with a cholesterol-lowering diet is the presumption that they're already eating healthy, and so don't need to change. But if you look at the status of cardiovascular health in U.S. adults, only about 1% have a bare minimum of healthy eating behaviors, such as 5-a-day fruits and veggies, eating beans, whole grains, drinking less than 3 cans of soda a week. What percentage of Americans hit all 7 of the Simple 7? 14,000 men and women were surveyed, and most had 2 or 3, but hardly any had all 7 simple health components. Just how low a prevalence was having 7 out of 7? only about 1 out of 2,000 Americans had all 7 factors intact. And the one they were missing the most? Diet. That should give us pause. Unfortunately, unhealthy behaviors extend into the medical profession. Just like smoking doctors are less likely to tell their patients to stop smoking, and couch potato docs are less likely to push exercise, or things like more fruits and vegetables. Doctors need to role model healthy behavior. This greatly enhances our credibility and effectiveness. Gone are the days of traditional authority when the fat physician, dropping cigarette ash down his gravy-stained vest, could credibly prescribe a change in behavior. Decades ago, we started to get the first inklings that a plant-based diet may be protective against diabetes. Studies going back a half-century found that those eating meat 1 or more days a week had significantly higher rates of diabetes, and the more frequently meat was eaten, the more frequent the disease. And this is after controlling for weight. Even at the same weight, those eating plant-based had but a fraction of the diabetes rates. And if anything, vegetarians should have had more diabetes just because they appear to live so much longer, so have more time to develop these kinds of chronic diseases. But no, apparently lower rates of death and disease. Fast forward 50 years to the Adventist II study, looking at 89,000 people, and we see a stepwise drop in the rates of diabetes as one eats more and more plant-based, down to a 78% lower prevalence among those eating strictly plant-based. Protection building incrementally as one moved from eating meat to eating less meat, to just fish, to no meat, and then to no eggs or dairy either. We see the same thing with another leading killer, high blood pressure. The greater the proportion of plant foods, the lower the rates of hypertension. And the same with excess body fat. The only dietary group not on average overweight were those eating diets composed exclusively of plant foods. But again, the same incremental drop with fewer and fewer animal products. This suggests it's not black and white, not all or nothing. Any steps we can make towards eating healthier may accrue significant benefits. Followed over time, vegetarian diets were associated with substantially lower incidence of diabetes, fewer new cases, indicating the potential of these diets to stem the current diabetes epidemic. What about eating a really healthy diet with just little meat, or is it better to eat none at all? Well, we have new insight this year from Taiwan. Asian diets in general tend to be lower in meat, higher in plant foods compared to Western diets. But whether a diet completely avoiding meat and fish would further extend the protective benefit of a plant-based diet wasn't known until now. Traditionally, Asian populations have had low rates of diabetes, but a diabetes epidemic has since emerged, and it appears to coincide with increased meat, animal protein, and animal fat consumption. But the westernization of Asian diets also brought along a lot of fast food and junk. So these researchers at the National University didn't want to just compare eating vegetarian to typical meat eaters, but compared Buddhist vegetarians to Buddhist non-vegetarians eating traditional Asian diets. Even the omnivores were eating a predominantly plant-based diet, consuming little meat and fish, with the women eating the equivalent of about a single serving a week, and men eating a serving every few days. That's just 8% of the meat intake in the U.S., 3% for the women. The question is it better to eat 3% or 0%? Again, both groups were eating healthy, zero soda consumption, for example, in any group. Despite the similarities in their diet, and after controlling for weight and family history and exercise and smoking, the men eating vegetarian had just half the rates of diabetes, and the vegetarian women just a quarter the rates. So even in a population consuming a really plant-based diet with little meat and fish, true vegetarians who completely avoided animal flesh while eating more healthy plant foods had lower odds for prediabetes and diabetes after accounting for other risk factors. They wanted to break it up into vegan versus ovo-lacto, like in the Adventist II study, but there were no cases at all of diabetes found within the vegan group. Raisins, like all fruits, have a variety of health benefits, but dried fruit is higher in calories per serving than fresh, so might they contribute to weight gain? This study helped set people's minds at ease. Men and women assigned to consume a cup of raisins a day for 6 weeks evidently offset the consumption of other foods in their diet, such that they experienced no significant change in weight or waist circumference. But what about in kids? Leave it to the California Raisin Marketing Board to dream up a study like this. An after-school snack of raisins lowers cumulative food intake in young children. Sounds good, right? But that's compared to potato chips and chocolate chip cookies. They gave kids raisins, grapes, chips, or cookies, and said they could eat as much as they wanted, and surprise, surprise, kids ate less fruit and more junk. But I guess naming the paper "Kids Prefer Cookies" would not have garnered the same kind of marketing board sponsor support. Reminds me of this study they did. Regular consumption of raisins may reduce blood sugar levels, compared to fudge cookies and Oreos. Or how about this one? Raisins were found to cause less of a blood sugar spike than Coca-Cola and candy bars. Though you can tell it was not funded by Big Raisin by their conclusion. Whether the general public should be advised to snack on fruit rather than on candy bars requires further debate and investigation. Guess who funded that one? Comparing raisins to chips and cookies was similarly unhelpful. This is the study I was expecting. 9 to 11-year-old boys and girls were told to eat all the grapes or raisins they wanted 30 minutes before a meal in which they could eat all the pizza they wanted. If you just gave them the meal, no snack, they ate 837 calories worth of pizza. If you gave them all-you-can-eat grapes before the meal, they ate 128 calories of grapes, but that seemed to fill them up a bit, so they ended up eating less pizza. But because they ate the snack and the meal, they ended up getting more calories overall. Still, grape calories are certainly better than pizza calories, but check this out. When given raisins instead, they ate even more snack calories, but the raisins were evidently so satiating, so filling, that they ate so much less pizza that they ate fewer calories overall. Now I know as parents there's a concern that if our kids eat snacks it might spoil their dinner, but when the snacks are fruit, and the meal is a pepperoni and 3-cheese pizza, the more we can ruin their appetite, the better. 100 years ago, the New York Times reported on a rather sophisticated study for the time, 4,600 cases of cancer studied over 7 years, suggesting that the increased consumption of animal foods was to blame. A century later, the latest review on the subject concluded that mortality from all causes put together, ischemic heart disease and circulatory and cerebrovascular disease, such as stroke, was significantly lower in those eating meat-free diets, in addition to less cancer and diabetes. I'm surprised they found such significant results, given that people in these studies typically didn't stop eating meat until late in life. For example, in the largest study done up until that time, up to a third ate vegetarian for less than 5 years, yet they still ended up with lower rates of heart disease, whether they were young or old, under 60 or over 60, whether they were normal weight or overweight, whether they used to smoke or never smoked. Regardless, those that had stopped eating meat had lower risks, suggesting that decades of higher-risk dietary behavior could be reversed within just years of eating healthier. If you look at countries that switched from eating traditional, more plant-based diets to more westernized diets, it may take 20 years for cancer rates to shoot up. It takes decades for most tumors to grow. For example, if you look in Asia, their dietary shift was accompanied by a remarkable increase in mortality rates of breast, colon, and prostate cancers. For example, death from breast cancer in Japan, or from prostate cancer. The line just goes straight up. But again, it can take years of a cancer-promoting diet and lifestyle. Same thing shown with migration studies. Men moving from rural China to the U.S. experience a dramatic increase in cancer risk, but tumors take time to grow. So it's remarkable to me that after most of a lifetime eating the standard Western diet, one can turn it around, reverse chronic disease risk with a healthier diet, even late in the game. So should we all start to eat vegetarian? This was the editorial that accompanied results from the largest study ever published on Americans eating plant-based diets, that found vegetarian diets associated with lower all-cause mortality, meaning that those who started eating vegetarian live, on average, longer lives. Now, this analysis included so-called semi-vegetarians who ate meat at least once a month, but no more than once a week. So it's not yet clear how bad meat eating is a few times a month for our longevity. What we can all agree on, though, is that we should limit our intake of junk food and animal fat and eat more fruits and vegetables. Most authorities will also agree that diet should include whole grains, beans, and nuts. Instead of fighting over whose diet's the best, it's time to acknowledge these common features of diets associated with less disease, and instead focus our attention on helping patients avoid the intense commercial pressures to eat otherwise. Ever since smoking was prohibited in nightclubs, customers have increasingly noted unpleasant smells, such as body odors. So, researchers in Europe thought they'd try to cover them up. They measured the effects of peppermint, for example, on dancing activity, and asked people to rate their energy level from calm and quiet to what looks like suicide bomber level. And indeed, people felt more cheerful, danced more, and so environmental fragrancing may be expected to have positive effects on club revenue. And so innovative nightclubs are already inviting aroma jockeys to smell the places up. The business community caught whiff of this and thought, hey, maybe we can get our secretaries to type faster. And it worked. Improved performance on clerical tasks associated with the administration of peppermint odor. They also used an electronic memory device to measure memory, Milton Bradley's Simon. Remember that? But it didn't work, did not improve memory. Still, if the scent of peppermint can increase typing performance, what about athletic performance? In an age where athletic competitions are frequently won or lost by mere hundredths of a second, athletes are continually looking for new ways to excel in their sport. So they threw some collegiate athletes onto a treadmill and piped different smells into their nostrils, and those on peppermint reported feeling less fatigued, more vigorous, less frustrated, and felt they just performed better. But did they actually perform better? This first study was just about the psychological aspects of athletic performance. This study measured actual performance. And participants were able to squeeze out an extra push-up before collapsing, and cut almost 2 seconds off a quarter-mile dash with an odorized adhesive strip stuck to their upper lip. Interestingly, there was no significant difference in basketball free throws. They think the reason is that free throws actually require some skill, and all the peppermint can do is really improve athletes' motivation. If an athlete does not have the skill to make the free throw, increasing the level of motivation will merely result in a more motivated athlete who still does not have the skill to make the free throw. Unfortunately, follow-up studies were not able to replicate these results, showing no beneficial effect of smelling peppermint on athletic performance. But what about eating peppermint? The effects of peppermint on exercise performance, measured before and after 10 days of drinking bottles of water with a single drop of peppermint essential oil in them. And all their performance parameters shot up, churning out 50% more work, 20% more power, and a 25% greater time to exhaustion, with improvements across the board in all the fancy physiological alphabet soup parameters that all the exercise geeks love, indicating increased respiratory efficiency. They attribute these remarkable results to the peppermint opening up airways, increasing ventilation, and oxygen delivery. Now, you can OD on this stuff. Peppermint oil is powerful stuff. Some woman tried chugging a bottle in an unsuccessful but nearly successful suicide attempt. But a few drops shouldn't be toxic. Still, I'd rather see folks blending fresh mint leaves into water rather than using the oil to get some dark green leafies in, kind of like a mojito without the rum or the sugar. Now, heavy mint consumption can lower libido. There are reports of men drinking 4 cups a day of spearmint or peppermint tea losing their sex drive, though frankly that may improve athletic performance even more, helping to keep their heads in the game. Because of the anti-androgenic effects, researchers decided to try it out on hairy women. And in a matter of just 5 days, were able to drop their free testosterone levels by about 30% with 2 cups of tea a day. There's actually a syndrome called PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, which can result in abnormally high testosterone levels in women, which can be successfully brought down with mint tea. The average American spends most of their waking life sitting down, which is associated with an increased risk of death, even among people who go to the gym after work and exercise regularly. Sedentary comes from the Latin word meaning to sit, but just because you're sitting doesn't mean you're sedentary. They aren't sedentary. She isn't sedentary. We're talking about not just sitting, but sitting without doing much of anything. And doing lots of that may double our risk of diabetes and heart disease and significantly shorten our lifespan, even at the highest levels of physical activity. Sitting 6 or more hours a day may increase mortality rates even among those running or swimming an hour a day, every day, 7 days a week. Why, though? One factor may be endothelial dysfunction, the inability of the inner lining of our blood vessels to relax our arteries normally in response to blood flow. Just like our muscles atrophy if we don't use them, when it comes to arterial function, it may be use it or lose it as well. Increased blood flow promotes a healthy endothelium. The cells lining our arteries can actually sense the shear force of blood flowing past. That flow is what maintains the stability and integrity of the inner lining of our arteries. Without that constant tugging flow, we may set ourselves up for heart disease. What if sitting all day is part of our job, though? Well, I've talked about using a standing or walking treadmill desk. We actually have some data now suggesting that treadmill desks may improve the health of office workers without affecting work performance, and walking may be preferable to standing, in terms of clearing fat out of our bloodstream, which may also play a role in arterial dysfunction. What if our office can't accommodate a standing or walking desk? Within an hour of sitting, blood starts pooling and blood flow starts to stagnate. So the more we can take breaks, where we take a stand for our health, join the wellness uprising, the better. Preliminary evidence from observational studies and interventional studies suggests that regular interruptions in sitting time can be beneficial. And it doesn't have to be long. Breaks could be as short as 1 minute, and not necessarily entail exercise, just like taking the trash out during commercials or something may be beneficial. What if we have a job where we're sitting down and can't take frequent breaks, like truck driving? Is there any way to improve our endothelial function sitting on our butts? Well, first we need to get rid of our butts. Smoking a single cigarette can significantly impair endothelial function. Lifestyle modification is a desirable way to prevent or treat endothelial dysfunction without the need for drugs. Now, I've talked about the effects of different kinds of foods on endothelial function. Well, recently researchers tried out curcumin, the yellow pigment in the spice turmeric. They showed that regular ingestion of curcumin, or up to an hour a day of aerobic exercise training, significantly improved endothelial function, and the magnitude of improvement in endothelial function was about the same. So does that mean we can be a couch potato as long as we eat curried potatoes? No. The combination of curcumin and exercise, both may work even better than either alone. Intake of saturated fats and added sugars, two of the primary components of a modern Western diet, is linked with the development of Alzheimer's disease. Now, there's been a global shift in dietary composition from traditional diets, high in starches and fiber, to what's been termed the Western diet, high in fat and sugar, low in whole plant foods. What's so great about fruits and vegetables? Plant-derived foods contain thousands of compounds with antioxidant properties, some of which can traverse the blood-brain barrier and have neuroprotective effects by assisting with antioxidant defense. There's this concept of brain rust, that neurodegenerative diseases arise from excess oxidative stress. But nature has gifted humankind with a plethora of plants, fruits, vegetables, nuts, and the diverse array of bioactive nutrients present in these natural products may play a pivotal role in prevention, one day even perhaps cure, various neurodegenerative diseases, such as Alzheimer's disease. Accumulated evidence suggests that naturally occurring plant compounds may potentially hinder neurodegeneration and even improve memory and cognitive function, as I've shared in my videos about blueberries and strawberries, and treating Alzheimer's with spices like saffron and turmeric. Vegetables may be particularly protective, in part because of certain compounds we eat that concentrate in our brain, found in dark green leafy vegetables. the consumption of which are associated with lower rates of age-related cognitive decline. When you look at systematic reviews on what we can do to prevent cognitive decline, you'll see conclusions like this. The current literature does not provide adequate evidence to make recommendations for interventions. Same with Alzheimer's. Currently, insufficient evidence exists to draw firm conclusions on the association of any modifiable factors with risk of Alzheimer's disease. They cite the lack of randomized controlled trials as the basis for their conclusions. RCTs are the gold standard used to test new medicines. You randomize people in two groups, half get the drug and half don't, to control for other factors. The highest level of evidence necessary, because drugs may kill 100,000 Americans every year. Not overdoses, not medication errors, not illicit drugs, just regular FDA-approved prescription drugs, the sixth leading cause of death in the United States. So you better make absolutely sure the benefits of new drugs outweigh the life-threatening risks. But we're talking about a healthier diet and exercise. The side effects are all good, so we don't need the same level of rigorous evidence to prescribe them. A modest proposal was published recently in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, an editorial calling for a longitudinal study of dementia prevention. They agreed that definitive evidence for the effectiveness of dementia prevention methods was lacking, so we need large-scale randomized trials. Let's start with 10,000 healthy volunteers in their 20s, split them into 5 groups. There's evidence, for example, that traumatic brain injury is a risk factor for Alzheimer's, because people with head injuries appear more likely to get the disease, but it's never been put to the test. So let's take 2,000 people and beat half of them in the head with baseball bats, and the other half will use styrofoam bats as a control. Until we have randomized controlled data, we can't just have physicians running around telling people not to get hit in the head. We should probably chain 1,000 people to a treadmill for 40 years and 1,000 people to a couch before recommending exercise. 1,000 forced to do crossword puzzles, another 1,000 forced to watch Jerry Springer reruns. Lots of meat and dairy, or not, for the next 40 years. And we can hook 1,000 folks on 4 packs a day, just to be sure. Look, we help our patients to quit smoking despite the fact that there's not a single randomized controlled trial where they held people down and piped smoke in their lungs for a few decades. It's time to realize that the ultimate study in regards to lifestyle and cognitive health simply cannot be done. Right? Yet the absence of definitive evidence should not restrict physicians from making reasonable recommendations based on the evidence that is available. A recent article in the journal Meat Science acknowledged that a sector of the population perceives meat as a food that is detrimental to their health because of studies associating meat consumption with heart disease and cancer. For these reasons, these meat consumers look for healthier food alternatives as a means to maintain good health. So this represents a good opportunity for the industry to develop some new products. Natural foods could be added to meat to reach those health-oriented consumers by boosting antioxidant levels. For example, foods like flax seeds and tomatoes are healthy, associated with reduced risks of cancer and cardiovascular disease. So by making flaxseed tomato burgers, they figure they can reduce saturated fat intake and less sugar somehow. It's like their flaxseed-fed pork idea, to produce enriched lard. Wouldn't it be easier just to cut out the middle pig and eat flax seeds ourselves? Flax seeds have been described as a miraculous defense against some critical maladies. Now, I'm a fan of flax, but this title seemed a bit over-exuberant. I figured something just got lost in translation. But then I saw this study, and realized maybe that title is not too far off. Rarely do we see a dietary study of this caliber, a prospective, double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized trial. You know how hard that is in a nutrition study? I mean, for drugs, it's easy. You take 2 identical-looking pills, one's active, one's placebo. Until the end of the study, neither the researcher nor the patient has any idea which is which, hence double-blind. But people tend to notice what they're eating, so how do you sneak a quarter cup of ground flax seeds into half of people's diets without them knowing it? They created these various flax or placebo-containing foods, and even added bran and molasses to match the color and texture, so it was all a big secret until 6 months later when they broke the code to see who ate which. Why test it on hypertension? Because having a systolic blood pressure over 115, that's the top number, may be the single most important determinant for death in the world today. If you take a bunch of older folks, most of them on an array of blood pressure pills, and don't improve their diet at all, despite the drugs, they may start out with on average hypertensive and stay hypertensive 6 months later. But those who are unknowingly eating ground flax seeds every day drop their systolic blood pressure about 10 points, and their diastolic, the lower number, by about 7 points. That might not sound like a lot, but a drop like that could cut stroke risk 46%, heart disease 29%, and that 10-point drop in the top number could have a similar effect on strokes and heart attacks. And for those that started out over 140, they got a 15-point drop. In summary, flaxseed-induced one of the most potent antihypertensive effects ever achieved by dietary intervention. In other words, the magnitude of this decrease in blood pressure demonstrated by dietary flaxseed is as good or better than any other nutritional interventions, and comparable to many drugs, which can have serious side effects. And they're not exaggerating about the comparable to drugs bit. The flax dropped systolic and diastolic up to 15 and 7. Compare that to powerful ACE inhibitors like Vasotec, which may only drop pressures 5 and 2. Calcium channel blockers like Norvasc and Cardizem, 8 and 3, half of what the flax could do. Right? And side effects include— compare this list to that of the side effect of flax seeds. It's pleasant, nutty flavor. During the 6-month trial, there were strokes and heart attacks in both groups. Even if the flax seeds can cut risk in half, though, any avoidable risk is unacceptable. Right? Well, isn't high blood pressure just inevitable as we get older? No, the prevalence of hypertension does increase dramatically with age, but not for everyone. People who eat more plant-based diets, or keep their salt intake low enough, tend not to exhibit any change in blood pressure with advancing age. So, flax is great, but always better to prevent the disease in the first place. One of the reasons people may undervalue diet and lifestyle changes is an overconfidence in the ability of pills and procedures to prevent disease. For example, people tend to wildly overestimate the power of things like mammograms and colonoscopies to prevent deaths from breast and bowel cancer, or the power of drugs like Fosamax to prevent hip fractures, or the power of cholesterol drugs to prevent fatal heart attacks. Patients believe statin drugs like Lipitor are about 100 times more effective than they actually are in preventing heart attacks. Most people wouldn't take multiple blood pressure medications if they knew the truth, which raises a dilemma for doctors. Right? Most patients want to be told the truth, want to be told what the chances the drugs will actually benefit them. But there's this tension between the patient's right to know and the likely reduction in patients' willingness to take the drug if they were so informed. If taking a cholesterol-lowering drug would reduce your risk of getting a heart attack over the next 5 years by 100%, well, then everyone would take it. Even if it were just a 50% chance of benefiting, most would still want to take the drugs. But if the chances of benefiting is just a few percent, hardly anyone would be willing to take the drugs every day for the rest of their lives. And that's the actual benefit. For most people, the chance of benefit is normally less than 5% over 5 years for cholesterol, blood pressure, blood-thinning drugs. It's no wonder that doctors seldom share these figures with patients. So even high-risk patients have less than a 5% chance of benefit, whereas patients don't want to take drugs unless they have at least a 20% chance, even those that just had a heart attack. The study therefore suggests that informing patients of the percentage chance of benefit from preventive drug strategies will substantially reduce the uptake of such drugs. Now, they recognize that for the individual, this is unlikely to be detrimental. After all, there's a 95% chance it won't do anything for them. But for the population at large, it would make a difference. So doctors and drug companies tend to oversell the benefits by conveniently not mentioning how tiny they actually are, knowing that most patients wouldn't take them if doctors divulged the truth. To practice non-lifestyle medicine is to practice deceptive medicine. The best cholesterol-lowering statin drugs can do here is an absolute risk reduction of 3.1% over 6 years. If Dr. Esselstyn's work can be replicated in a randomized controlled trial, then a whole food plant-based diet will have been shown to work 20 times better, an absolute risk reduction of 60% after less than 4 years. Overall, 99.4% of patients that stuck with the diet avoided major cardiac events, such as death from heart attack. So when we have to decide whether we want to go diet versus drugs, it's not a choice between eating healthy to prevent a heart attack or taking a pill to prevent a heart attack, because in 97% of cases, the pills won't do anything. Right? We're risking side effects for nothing. Whereas if we treat the underlying root cause of the disease by eating this healthy cholesterol-free diet, we may even reverse the progression of the disease. Stop eating an artery-clogging diet, and our bodies can start dissolving that plaque away, opening up arteries in some cases without drugs, without surgery. This wasn't an Ornish study, so no exercise requirement, no meditation, no stress management, no yoga, just a healthy, whole food, plant-based diet may work 20 times better than drugs to combat our #1 killer. Now that's something doctors may want to tell their patients. Yes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, but a pound isn't that heavy. Why change our diet and lifestyle? We can just wait and let modern medicine fix us up. Previously, I noted that patients tend to wildly overestimate the ability of cancer screening and drugs like cholesterol-lowering medications to prevent disease. So much so that if patients were told the truth, how little they'd actually benefit, 90% said they wouldn't even bother taking them. The reason we should eat healthier rather than just counting on a medical techno-fix is that the same overconfidence may exist for treatment, too. In a massive study of more than 200,000 trials, they discovered that yes, pills and procedures can certainly help, but genuine, very large effects with extensive support from substantial evidence appear to be rare in medicine, and large benefits for mortality, making people live significantly longer, almost entirely non-existent. Right? We're great for broken bones and curing infections, but for chronic disease, our leading cause of death and disability, modern medicine doesn't have much to offer, and in fact can sometimes do more harm than good. In my Uprooting the Leading Cause of Death talk, I noted that side effects from prescription drugs kill an estimated 100,000 Americans every year, in effect making medical care the 6th leading cause of death in the United States. But that's just for the deaths from taking medications as prescribed. Another 7,000 deaths occur from getting the wrong medication by mistake. 20,000 deaths from other errors in hospitals. Hospitals are dangerous places. An additional 80,000 of us die from hospital-acquired infections, more recently estimated at 99,000 deaths. But can you really blame doctors for these deaths? You can when they don't wash their hands. We've known since the 1840s that the best way to prevent hospital-acquired infections is through hand washing, yet compliance rates among healthcare workers rarely exceeds 50%, and doctors are the worst. Even in a medical intensive care unit, even if you slap up a contact precaution sign signaling particularly high risk, less than a quarter of doctors wash their hands. Many physicians greeted the horrendous mortality data due to medical error with disbelief, and concerned that the information would undermine public trust. But if doctors still won't even wash their hands, how much trust do we deserve? So you could go in for a simple operation and come out with a life-threatening infection, or not come out at all. And 12,000 die from surgeries that were unnecessary in the first place. For those keeping score, that's 225,000 people dead from iatrogenic causes, meaning death by doctor, death by medical care. And that's mostly just for patients in a hospital. In an outpatient setting, adverse effects can send millions to the hospital and result in perhaps 199,000 additional deaths. And this is not including all those just non-fatally injured, like, oops, we accidentally amputated the tip of your penis. And these estimates are on the low end. The Institute of Medicine estimated that deaths from medical errors may kill up to 98,000 Americans. That would bump us up to 284,000 dead. But even if we stick to the lower estimate, the medical profession constitutes the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States. It goes heart disease, cancer, then me. One respondent pointed out that it was misleading to call medicine the third leading cause of death, since many of those we kill also had heart disease or cancer. Doctors aren't out there gunning down healthy people. Only people on medications are killed by medication errors or side effects. Right? You have to be in a hospital to be killed by a hospital error. Exactly. Right? That's why lifestyle medicine is so important, because the most common reasons people are on drugs or in hospitals is for diseases that can be prevented with a healthy diet and lifestyle, as I've covered before. Right? The best way to avoid the adverse effects of medical care is to not get sick in the first place.